بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'm very honored, pleased to have received this collection from Ismail Books in the UK, and I just want to give you an insight into this book because I think it's a very important book to read, to study, to give you at least an insight into the early thinking that took place in the Hanafi school. So the book, it's called Sharh Mukhtasar al-Karkhi. So it's a commentary on the Mukhtasar of Karkhi. And the author who wrote commentary is someone that's very well known in the Hanafi school of law, Abu Hassan al-Quduri, who's a very, very famous scholar in the Hanafi school. He died here, the date is written, 428 Hijri as well. So he wrote a commentary on the Mukhtasar of Karkhi. Imam Karkhi, who we'll talk about in a few moments, is a very famous scholar as well, and he died in 340 Hijri. So before Imam Quduri. Imam Quduri wrote a commentary on his book. And I just want to look at this book a little bit, just to give you an insight into some things that might be useful. What I want to say is that print quality is exemplary. Excellent print quality, excellent book. Very important book, available from Ismail Books, as I mentioned, and it's in 9 volumes. So you can see the print quality instantly. It's always good having the bookmark as well in the book as well. So small details like that make a difference. I'm just going to take you through the Muqaddamah of the book, which is written by the Muhaqqiq, so the person who researched this book, who kind of put this book together, if you like, from the manuscripts. And his name is Dr. Abdullah Nadir Ahmad Abdul Rahman. May Allah bless him and increase him in knowledge, inshallah ta'ala, and allow us all to benefit from this important book as well. So he has a few things to say right at the outset of the book as well. I'm going to share something that I've found with you, and maybe give you one example in the book that might help you study this book in a fruitful way, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So like I mentioned, this book is one of the early books from the Hanafi school of law, and it was, as we mentioned, written by the actual text itself was written by Imam Karkhi in the 4th century. Imam Quduri then wrote a commentary on it, and there's something written here. It's mentioned by Imam Quduri in his Muqaddamah that the Mukhtasar, in this Mukhtasar, are gathered things from the branches of fiqh which are not gathered in other books. And in terms of the importance of this book is that we don't actually have the book by Imam Karkhi, the actual text itself, we don't actually have that, but it's been received by us because of the commentaries that we have in the book. Now this book is the first time it's been printed to my knowledge like this, and so it's a very, very important book into the insight of early thinking in Hanafi school of law. And if you look at the introduction, the Muqaddamah, I'm just going to share a few things with you, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which might be useful as well. So it's a very important book from the furu', the branches of the madhab, and it's mu'tamad, like people would rely on this text as well. And the fuqaha, the jurists of the Hanafi school, used to refer to this book quite a lot. It's an important book that they will refer back to as well. And it's also mentioned that whatever is in these books, it gives you an insight into the early thinking of the school as well. And one of the things that you will find in this book, it's difficult to differentiate, for example, between what's written by Imam Karkhi, the author himself, and the Sharh, Imam Quduri. So if you look in here, very difficult to work this out. So he mentions this as a sort of warning, if you like, before you go into the book. And then later on, he also mentions that he begins with Lughawi, Bijanib al-Lughawi. So there's a linguistic discussion there. There are evidences brought forth from the verses in the Quran, from the traditions of the Prophet alayhi salam as well. And so you'll find this in this book as well. Also, he provides jawanibs of the mas'ala, so different perspectives of how the mas'ala can be, a particular question at hand can be looked at as well. And so this is mentioned in the book as well. There's also something worth mentioning on this book as well, that you'll find like khilaf between the ai of the madhab. So he'll mention how the early founders of the school, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Muhammad, Imam Yusuf, etc., discussed and debated some of these talking points within the school as well. So this is something to bear in mind as well. And he says that if you want to know the makana, like this, the standing of this book, then you should look into the books that were written in the lifetime of the author and before him as well. So this is very, very important to also bear in mind as well. Then there's discussions around the particular manuscripts that were used in the book as well. I'm just going to move on a little bit further, just to, as they always have surah, the makhtutat, so you get images of the book, the original text itself. Then there's a tarjuma of Imam Quduri, so we get an insight into Imam Quduri here, just a brief insight into it, into the author himself. And then there's some discussion around the original writer, which is Imam al-Karkhi. So you can see this in the text itself as well. So it's a very important book. And what I want to do now is to just give you like an insight into the book as well itself, just to give you like an example of a particular discussion which might help you to think about how you might want to use these sort of texts, because this book is a very early text as well. But before that, it's mentioned here by Imam Quduri that Abu Ali Shashi would say that whoever memorizes this kitab has memorized what is transmitted by our companions, and whoever understands it, this text has understood what our companions have indeed understood as well. So this book is very, very important, of course. Now what I want to do, like I mentioned, is to take you on a small journey, and this is found in the book later on. And I'm just going to pick a mas'ala which I just thought was useful because I'm teaching this to my students, just to give you an insight into what's going on here. So this is about najasa, impurities. Now you'll notice the format is not sometimes something that we're used to. And the way to understand this is if you look in the back of the book, you'll find it is organized according to chapters and topics, but you'll have discussions taking place there which will help you to find things that you might want to look into. So for example, this is about najasa, and what is the minimum, fi qalil najasa, what is the minimum that is ascribed to impurities. Now if you look in books like Hidayah, which emerged much later on, for example, we know Sahibi Hidayah, one of the important books in Hanafi school, he passed away in 593, so many hundreds of years later, a few hundred years later, after Imam Karkhi, Imam Quduri here as well. But you get an insight into what's going on. So if you think about, for a second, if you think about najasa or impurities, what we get an insight into is that there was this idea of takhfif, which basically means that there was this idea running through about making things easy for people. And impurities of two types. One is a heavy type, one is a lighter type. And whenever there was a difference of opinion amongst the scholars, they would make it easy for people. They would do takhfif, and they would go from a higher form of impurity to a lower form of impurity. And what you find here is very, very interesting. He says, وَكَانَ الْمَعْلَى فِيهِ أَنَّهُ فِي حُكْمٍ يَسِيرٍ, that there's this idea of making things easy for people, because impurities, if you're going to be really strict, you're going to make it difficult for people to be in a state of purity. And so, and people live, especially in those days, people live in a world where filth was around them, and it's impossible to completely remain clean as well. And there's also like other ideas that take place here. So here's another one. And so this is about the types of najasa, the types of impurity. Mughallada, mukhafa. There's this idea of heavy impurity and light impurity. And he talks about what impurity, heavy impurity is, and they have this discussion around the size of a dirham and where that comes from. But here is something interesting in amongst the text. وَلِأَنَّ أَصْلَ النَّجَاسَةِ فِي مَوْضِعِ اسْتِنْجَاءٍ مَعْفُونٍ. This idea that when impurity is in its place, i.e. in its place of where it's meant to be, then it's overlooked, it's forgiven. And you'll find this meaning or this logic in the school of Hanafis, the Hanafi school of law, quite often. So I'll just give you one example. When they talk about blood flowing, when blood stays in its place, it doesn't break the wudu. But the moment it leaves its place and goes to another place, where, for example, in Quduri mentioned hukm al-tathhir, where it's meant to be pure because it's moved from its original place, that place then wudu breaks. So there's an idea here that if something is in its place and it's fine, the moment it moves to another place, then something happens. There's a ruling, there's an implication, is what I'm saying as well. Just to give you another insight, so this is about najasa, which is mughallada. So this is heavy impurities. Now this is really, really interesting. And those of you who are studying Hidayah, for example, or Quduri, will find this very, very interesting, because if you remember in Hidayah, for example, there's this discussion about impurities, and there's a discussion around if impurity is light, for example, then for example, the urine of an animal whose meat can be eaten. In Hidayah it's mentioned that you can pray with that clothing, right? If the urine of an animal comes on your clothing and it's light, as long as it doesn't reach a quarter of the clothing. Now the quarter is very, very interesting as well, because this is where the Hanafis try and maintain consistency in when they are setting limits. So the quarter, for example, when it comes to the masa of the head, these sort of places. But that's another discussion that we can have another place. But the point here is very, very interesting, and you see this becoming more refined later on. So the reason I want to mention this one is that you see this discussion taking place very early on in the school with Imam Quduri and Imam al-Karkhi, and then you see Sahib Hidayah, who comes later on in the 6th century, refining this, and you'll notice this. It isn't absolutely clear, but you'll notice this in the Hidayah. So I just made a point because I numbered the mas'ala. So this is mas'ala 170 in Hidayah. On page 131, the volume number 1, you'll find this discussion in detail. This is the Maktaba Bushra print that you can look into if you want to compare. But what he says is very, very interesting, because there's this idea that when there is a lack of clarity, or the scholars disagree on something, or traditions, there's two traditions, on one saying one thing, another saying another thing, hadith saying one thing, hadith saying something else, then what the fuqaha do is they do a form of takhfif. They make it easy for people, right? So for example, let's just look through about it here. So when najasa mughallada inda Abu Hanifa, so what is heavy impurity according to Imam Abu Hanifa? Where we have a nas, where we have a text, and there is nothing from that we've received that talks about it being pure. So we have a text that tells us impure, and we don't have anything that opposes it, right? اختلف الناس فيها اتفقوا لأن الناس إذا فرض على المعارض تأكد حكمه. And this is like an usul that I've kind of just highlighted here, that when you have a text and it's singular, and there's nothing that's saying the opposite to it or ostensibly contradicting it, you have a text that says something else, then it emphasizes hukum, like it's strong, right? So you've got this idea already developing early on, but we haven't found something else for a certain thing that tells us something else, so therefore it's important to follow it, right? And then he says this can be to do with things around impurities, feces and impurities as well, because we know that the text has told us about certain feces being impure, and the Prophet ﷺ has told us as well. And but he says here that we haven't found about certain impurities a text that goes against it, but there's an ikhtilaf, right? Then he says, well, this is like teaching how to think, but we're saying that when you have a text, that's a form of proof. And ikhtilaf, if the scholars disagree amongst themselves, that can't be a proof, because Allah says in the Quran, فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, that when you disagree about something, go to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, go to Quran and Sunnah. And so we move away this khilaf by referring to the Quran and Sunnah. However, you have Imam Abu Yusuf and Muhammad who say that whenever something there's room for ijtihad in its impurity, and you can debate it, then you can't make it a heavy form of impurity. It becomes a light form of purity as well. And they also give like a reason for it as well. So they also say that impurities, sometimes what happens is it's so predominant, it's so much everywhere, that you have to kind of think about, well, we don't want to burden people. So can you see? So whenever there's ijtihad in something, there's room for ijtihad, then the hukum becomes lighter. And it becomes like when you have one text and another text saying something else. So let me just give you like an example of how this happens later on in the Hanafi school. And remember I said the principle is that whenever there's a lack of clarity or scholars disagree on something, here in the case of impurity, then it's a lighter form of impurity. Takhfif takes place as well. So for example, Imam Abu Hanifa, may Allah be pleased with him, we find there's a conflicting textual evidence, right? We find that the Prophet ﷺ said that istanzahu min al-bawl fa inna ammat azab al-qabr minhu. Stay away from urine, and many reasons, one of the main reasons people will be punished in the grave is because of being careless when it comes to urine. But then you also find another tradition about where the Prophet ﷺ gave this tribe, the Iranian, this idea of like they could drink certain urine, right? So you have like two texts. As soon as you have two texts, there's this idea that there's takhfif taking place as well, right? So, or when like the jurists disagree about something, when the jurist disagrees about, for example, Imam Muhammad will have a view on something, and Imam Yusuf will have another view on something. Whenever the mujtahids disagree on something, there's takhfif, right? So there's an idea of what I call epistemic humility as well. And this is because Imam Muhammad, for example, he would say that land animals that can be eaten, their urine is clean because of the tradition that we mentioned. For Imam Abu Hanifa and Yusuf, their urine is impure, right? And for Imam Abu Hanifa, because there's traditions that are conflicting, the two traditions about being punished in the grave because of urine, but also a tribe that drank urine, we can't be as certain. And so they have this Imam Muhammad, he has a tradition where he says it's pure. And Abu Yusuf, he says, well, if the mujtahids disagree on the principle that's operating here, it becomes a light form of impurity. So there's this idea that whenever there's textual evidence that seems to be conflicting with one another, or the scholars have room for ijtihad and they are debating and the merits of a certain position, then there's takhfif. So, and you can see like this discussion taking place right here. And then later on, you'll see how it develops through Imam Quduri and through how it develops further through say, for example, Imam Marghinani rahimahullah ta'ala. And so there's also discussions about light form of impurity as well. وَأَمَّا مَا وَرَدَ فِي نَجَاسَتِهِ نَصٌّ وَفِي طَهَارَةِ نَصٌّ. So this is what I was saying before, that when you have two texts saying one thing, another one saying anything, then فَصَارَ مُعَاذٍ لَسَ الَّذِي لَوْ إِنْفَرَدَ أَوْجَبَ لِلطَّهَارَةِ فَيُؤَثِّرُ فِي التَّخْفِيفِ. Then it will have takhfif, like you can't be as strict. And so what you want to do is you want to kind of like get these legal meanings, that whenever there's apparent conflict, or whenever jurists disagree among something, when there's ijtihad taking place, then there's a sense of humility, there's a sense of openness, there's a sense of epistemic humility and so forth as well. And so this is very, very important when you're studying fiqh, that when things are open to debate and there are different evidences, one should not be strict. One should not be binary in their thinking. One should be trying to work out, well, what is the truth here? Okay. So this is something to bear in mind. Here, and then they talk about another one here is this idea of kasir al-fahish, when things are like so predominant impurities, right? And here, I'll end with this. He says, so you have a whole discussion around like what are these limits, right? And fuqaha talk about this. You'll find this in Hidayah, discussions around kasir al-fahish and so forth as well. But the point here is that I think it translates as excess that is widespread, right? And here he says it's left according to the custom of the people. So what do people consider to be like kasir al-fahish, like a huge amount of impurities as well? So I hope I haven't lost you too much with that. This is just one of the things about fiqh that I really believe people should do is really engage with it at a deep level. And when it engages with it at a deep level, it's very, very, it's a form of ibadah. When a person studies fiqh at a deep level, you're studying the seerah, the life of the Prophet ﷺ at a very deep level, a committed level. It's a form of ibadah. But also, when you study it at this level, you get to understand that the law is reasonable, the Sharia is reasonable. It's based on a very interesting coming together of reason and revelation. So I hope you found that useful. Please do provide any feedbacks. There's lots of other things that I could have said about the text. I just wanted to bring you a sort of insight into how one way a student like me might want to use this book. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.